Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I want to review episode 4 of season 3 of Strange New Worlds called A Space Adventure Hour. And there were a few things I did enjoy in the episode, but overall it really annoyed me for lots of reasons. And the main one is, of course, the continuity blunder of having the holodeck, which seem to be just as good, if not better, than the ones in TNG. And it's obviously a huge continuity mistake, as I will demonstrate, and they are self-aware of it. So in the very end of the episode, they try to kind of explain it away with some glib answer, some lame excuse for why it will disappear for a while and only come back later in the future. And the way they did it is just so lazy. Wouldn't it be simpler to simply admit this is a new timeline, that maybe because of all the time traveling and technologies arriving to the past from the future, maybe that's what changed everything and that's why they're having technologies like this earlier than they should, and so that would be so much simpler and more logical, and instead they're still clinging to the idea that this is a direct prequel to TOS, and they constantly violate the continuity and then try to make up excuses for it to try to make it fit in, which makes it even more annoying, in my opinion, because it's even stupider that way. Do you remember when Scotty was found by the Enterprise D and he was so much amazed by the ship of how big the quarters are? He said even an admiral wouldn't get such quarters on a starship in my day, which contradicts everything we see in this show, in which the rooms are so much bigger and so much more luxury on the ship, which visually I enjoy. I like that style, but it doesn't fit with that line by Scotty. And there was a scene in which Geordi told him, wait until you see the holodeck. Because obviously holodecks did not yet exist in his time. And there was even a scene in Voyager in which Ensign Kim directly stated that there were no replicators or holodecks in the 23rd century. And in TNG, Scotty went to the holodeck not knowing what it is. He told to the holodeck, the android at the bar told me that you could show me in my old ship. So obviously he did not yet know what the holodeck is. And yet in this episode of this supposedly prequel, we see that Scotty himself was running the first test of a holodeck on a starship, and he was designing the programs there, and the holodeck they showed us in this episode was just as good as the ones in TNG, that people could not tell who is a hologram or a real person, and there were smells and tastes. So that seems like a huge contradiction, because in TNG everybody was so amazed to see the holodeck. And I made excuses for it in the past, saying maybe they are simply amazed by the quality. Maybe holodecks did exist before, but they were not as good yet. And actually in the old animated show, which is set directly after TOS, they did have the rec room, which was basically a holodeck, and yet we didn't actually see people being created there. So it was only views and only places that they could simulate, and also because it's all animated, we can't really know how well it looks compared to real life. So it's all a cartoon basically, so maybe it did not look exactly like the real thing when they were in there. They never talked about it. So we can assume the quality of the simulation was not really exactly like real life. And they were not yet creating people in there, so it could be like a more primitive version of a holodeck. Also in Voyager there was one episode about some fantasy land inside the holodeck in which kids are playing, and Janeway said that when she was 6 years old she also ran the same program. So we know that her dad was an admiral, so maybe that's why she had access to advanced holodecks, and again maybe the quality was not as good as the ones we see later in TNG, so we did not actually see that. We're only hearing her stories of how she used to go to a holodeck when she was a little kid, so maybe it wasn't as good as the ones in TNG, and that's why all the people in TNG who first went into the holodeck were always so amazed by that. You know, Dr. Pulaski came into the holodeck and said that she never saw one with such sophistication. And Riker was so amazed by the view and all of it. So we can assume that maybe holodecks did exist. Obviously, they did not just show up one day out of the blue. Obviously, it had to be some kind of evolution of the holographic technology. So obviously, all kinds of older versions of it probably did exist before, but they were simply not as good. And also there was that episode when Picard went to the holodeck and he was so much amazed by it, saying the smells, the sounds, everything felt so real. So he was being amazed by the quality of the holodeck. So when we had that scene in Star Trek Discovery of Captain Lorca and Ash Tyler going into a simulator and fighting a bunch of Klingons, they were just shooting them, so we can say it was just target practice, and that those holograms were not really solid because we didn't see them touching them, and so I could come up with excuses that it was a more primitive version of the holodeck. And yet in this show, just a few years later, we have a holodeck which is exactly like the ones in TNG. So why were they so amazed by it in TNG? Why was Captain Picard talking about the smell and the touch of things and all of it and being so amazed when this technology existed for a century? So that's why it's so annoying. And just because in the very end of the episode they say, oh, the holodeck is too dangerous, so we're going to put it in a box and hide it somewhere for a century, it doesn't make any sense. And also when it came back in TNG, it was just as dangerous, so they did not actually solve any of the problems. So once again, people got locked inside there, the safeties were not working, and you couldn't communicate with people. So exactly the same problems as we saw in this episode happened again when they brought the holodeck back in TNG, supposedly, and so it doesn't make sense. If they shut it off for a century to work on these problems, how come they haven't solved them by the time of TNG? So none of this makes any sense, and so Scotty is personally running the tests, so why was he so surprised by the holodeck in TNG? I guess when the doors to the turbolift closed after Geordi said that, maybe Scotty then told him, you know what, I actually was the one who ran the first holodeck test on a starship in the history of Starfleet, you just don't know about it. Maybe that conversation happened. Maybe I'll do edits like that for fun to try to make it all fit together, but obviously it doesn't really fit. Also, didn't they say in season 2 of Discovery that because the holograms on the Enterprise were causing malfunctions, they're now removing the entire holographic system and the ship will never have holograms again, ever? They specifically said that, I guess maybe in response to people like me complaining about the holographic communications being used all the time, because that was another kind of continuity mistake, because they first introduced that idea in Deep Space Nine, and everyone were behaving as if it's a brand new idea to use holograms to communicate with people on other ships instead of just view screens, and yet they were doing that in Discovery all the time. And even when we saw the Enterprise in Discovery, they were also using holograms. And then there was a scene in which Pike said, rip out all the holograms on the Enterprise because they cause some malfunction, and so we'll never use holograms again, we'll just use the view screens. And yet now they have a holodeck on the ship which is just as good as the ones in TNG, so it doesn't make sense. It does fit with the rec room we saw in the animated show, but as I explained, because it was all a cartoon, we don't really know the quality of it, so we can assume it's a more primitive version of the holodeck, and they could not create people inside there yet. And also in the end of that episode, they simply opened the doors of the rec room by force to rescue them from being trapped inside there. So if that's possible, why do they not do that in this episode? Also, when they showed them going into the holodeck, the door kind of disappeared right away, and yet that's not how it was done in TNG. The door and the arch were always visible until you turn on the holograms, and here La'an walks in and then the door itself disappears, and so that also doesn't seem to fit. There was an interesting twist that the Spock we saw in the holodeck later on was revealed to be a hologram himself, so it was all part of the simulation from the start, because La'an asked the computer to create a challenge for her that will be hard for her to solve, and so the Spock we see helping her turned out to be supposedly the villain in the end, and she figured it out because he was being too cold and emotionless and logical, the way Spock is supposed to be. But she could tell it's not really him because the Spock she knows is more emotional than that. So it's as if the computer knew Spock from the descriptions of what he's supposed to be, but didn't know what he was really like on the show. And that's how she was able to tell it's not really him in the end. And it's all part of this love story they're building up between Spock and La'an being in love, so I guess we'll wait and see where it goes. And it also makes me wonder, where was the real Spock across this entire episode? Because, you know, the whole ship was in danger, there were all these problems, and we only see the Spock in the holodeck who turned out to be a fake Spock, so where was the real one across the episode? How come we never saw him? Why wasn't he on the bridge or something? And also they kind of ripped off the idea of Moriarty, you know, in that episode of TNG, when Geordi told the computer to create an adversary that will be able to defeat Data, and then the computer made Moriarty be self-aware and to be able to give commands to the computer. So apparently that was not the first time such a thing happened, because exactly the same thing happened here, when the computer from the very beginning, before she turned on the simulation, Spock in the holodeck was already a hologram. So when she called him later to come in and help her, because supposedly he left the holodeck and she was alone there, and then later she called him and then the fake one came in, did the computer prevent her from contacting the real Spock and instead made her talk with the fake Spock and then brought him into the simulation? So is the computer really so clever to do such a thing and to be able to fool her? So until the end of the episode, she did not know it's a fake Spock. Why was Picard so amazed when he went into a similar kind of simulation? He was so much amazed by the smell and the touch of things and all of it. So why was he so amazed when the technology existed for a century? So they buried it in some secret vault in Starfleet and classified it for a century. Why? It's the same kind of lame excuse as in the end of season 2 of Discovery, when they said they're simply classifying everything for no reason. They had the spore drive and all the amazing technology of Discovery, and for some reason they decided to simply classify all of it and never recreate it. But why? It was never explained why they had to do it. So here they say the holodeck is too dangerous, and that's why they have to stop using it, basically. And it's also funny how during this test of the holodeck, they had to fly the ship toward a neutron star which is collapsing to study it at the same time as the holodeck was being tested for the first time. And then Scotty says, the holodeck needs more power, so I'm rerouting all power to the holodeck as they're falling toward that star. So that was kind of ridiculous. Why not do the tests in a different time to when the ship is in such danger and needs all the power it can get? And so that also was annoying. And also, when Scotty lost contact with La'an in the holodeck, he didn't want to tell the captain. He kept it secret. He tried to solve the problem by himself. He only told Uhura, and they never told the captain that there are problems with the holodeck. And then later, suddenly the holodeck was draining all the power toward itself, and then the ship lost the shields and all of it. So basically Scotty endangered the entire ship for no good reason, simply because he didn't want to tell the captain. And then in the end of the episode, number one wanted to talk with him about, and I thought she's going to reprimand him for putting the ship in danger, and instead she says, you know, Scotty, you shouldn't feel alone on the ship, we're all part of a team, it's okay to ask for help, and all kinds of pep talk like that, instead of putting him in the brig for failing to report a dangerous situation to his superior officers. So that also kind of annoyed me. And Uhura was also complicit in that. Why didn't she tell the captain about all these problems? So that's part of the usual things that annoy me in the show, that the chain of command is not really working on the show. There is no discipline. Everyone can do whatever they want and get away with it, so that also is annoying to me. And also in the very end, Scotty recommended that in the future the holodeck should have its own separate power source. And I guess that fits with what we saw in Voyager, because in Voyager, even when the ship had little power, the holodecks were always working, and also in Star Trek Picard they said that the holodeck has its own power source. But the problem is that in TNG it was not the case, because in TNG whenever the ship was low on power, the computer did turn off the holodecks to conserve power. We had a scene like that of Geordi being in the holodeck, trying to figure something out, and then the computer turned off his simulation because they were low on power, and he had to get special permission from the captain to power it back up again. And so I think they only made that up in Voyager as an excuse for how come the ship is constantly low on supplies and stuff like that, and yet they can always go to the holodeck. So I think they made up that excuse that the holodeck uses some different energy system simply to be able to have holodeck episodes despite of the ship being low on supplies and energy and fuel and all of it. So I think they just made it up for Voyager as an excuse to have holodeck episodes no matter what, and then they repeated that in Star Trek Picard, and now they're saying that Scotty was actually the one who suggested it, so it doesn't really make any sense. And why not simply create some way to open up the holodeck if there's trouble? How come they get locked in there and unable to get out? And they didn't solve it by the time of TNG. And a funny personal story, when I started watching Star Trek TNG as a little kid, I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I did not yet understand English, and I could not yet read the subtitles. So when I was watching it and seeing all the holodeck episodes, I remember thinking the holodeck was just a time machine, because they also never showed the room with the yellow lines in the first 2 seasons of TNG. They just showed the door opening and them walking into the past. So I always thought it's just a time machine. And I was wondering how come the people in the past couldn't see the door opening up in the middle of the street and people coming in. How come no one noticed that? But I remember how fascinating it was that they simply could time travel to the past so easily, like the Iconian gateways. And so to me it was fascinating, and only later on I realized it was a holodeck, and I was kind of disappointed by it. And so why not make an episode of actually going to the past or to some different planet? It would be so much more interesting. I made a few videos about that topic of how in TOS, because they did not yet have a holodeck, that kind of forced the show to have episodes which are actually set on planets similar to Earth of the past, or to actually go to the past of Earth, and it was always more interesting than just a holodeck simulation in which there are no real stakes except the characters being stuck in there, which makes the whole idea kind of ridiculous. Why are they constantly going to this room, which is so dangerous when they get locked in there and almost dying all the time? So it was kind of ridiculous in TNG. So I think it would have been better off if this show simply did not touch the holodeck idea. Simply make some other scenario that would put them in such a situation, or make it some kind of alien experiment or something of some more advanced aliens that do have advanced holodecks. It would have been so much more interesting to have something new instead of remaking the exact same ideas that we saw a million times in TNG. So once again a Dixon Hill kind of adventure, and once again a Moriarty kind of thing, and so we saw that already and it was better back then, so what's the point of remaking it when it doesn't even fit continuity, and they are self-aware of the fact it doesn't fit it? That's why they had that lame excuse in the end. So if they're aware of it, why are they still doing it? And it's also frustrating that we have so few episodes in general of the show, only 10 episodes in a season, and yet they waste most of the episodes on these kinds of ideas of silly episodes and humoristic self-parodies and stuff like that, which can be fun, but when are we going to get an actual serious story with something new, with some kind of alien civilization for a change? And I did kind of enjoy that first scene when they were making like a parody of the original Star Trek and all kinds of older shows and doing it kind of sillier on purpose. I did actually enjoy that. I did find it funny, and they showed some exotic alien which has huge eyes on its hands, and I thought to myself, you know, as silly as they make it out to be, it's still more interesting than any actual alien they invented on the show. And so it's kind of a problem, I think, when the show never does actual, real, new or original stories at all. And it's also sad that somewhere in the middle of this episode, when we saw Uhura explaining what that show inside the show was about, it was actually that first clip we saw of the parody of Star Trek is kind of an old TV show called The Last Frontier, which was set inside that holodeck program that La'an was running. And so there was one scene when Uhura tried to explain what it was about, and she was basically describing the old Star Trek shows. And that was actually a really good bit of dialogue, but I kept thinking to myself, so they are self-aware of what the Star Trek show is supposed to be about, so why are they not doing it themselves? We never had any actual episode of such a story in the actual show. It was all just silly episodes. And yet they are aware of what Star Trek is supposed to be about, so why are they not doing it themselves? Are they incapable of actually creating new stories like that instead of just ripping off and remaking the same ideas over and over again, and then kind of poking fun at the older shows with kind of meta commentary, some of which I did actually enjoy, but I kept being frustrated because I was thinking, why are they not able to actually do that themselves? So even that fake parody version of Star Trek they showed in the show was actually more interesting to me than the actual show. So I would actually rather watch that, as silly as it was still more interesting to me, and it was still closer to what Star Trek is supposed to be than the actual series that we're now watching. So that's kind of weird. So those scenes of the show inside the show was actually the best part of the episode in my opinion, because I did actually enjoy that. There was a part when Kirk was trying to sit on the chair from behind, so he was raising his leg to try to get over it, and the episode was actually directed by Jonathan Frakes, and so I wonder if he's the one who put that idea in there. So I do enjoy those kinds of jokes, but this episode came awfully close to being kind of self-mocking of its own legacy characters and actors. The way that he impersonated Shatner's Kirk in an exaggerated way, like in all kinds of sitcoms, and Jim Carrey did that, and I think there's a video of Shatner himself reacting to parodies of him and complaining about it. So what would be his reaction if he sees this episode? If he sees how the Star Trek of today is actively mocking him as an actor, as if he was a bad actor. So that's kind of weird. Like, if other shows and movies do that, that's okay, I guess, but Star Trek itself poking fun at its own legacy characters and actors in such a way which really kind of bordered on being nasty, that is kind of disturbing. And specifically when they showed, as if the actor was kind of a bad guy, they showed that the actor was having affairs and sleeping around with women on the set, and one of those women called him a chauvinistic egomaniac, and other people told him that he's a bad actor, that he's incapable of delivering a line as a human. And they also had like a parody of Gene Roddenberry, because the producer of that show inside the show was kind of talking like Gene Roddenberry, and then there was a moment when he was angry on the set and said, "Does no one care about my vision?" And so is this show actively mocking its own legacy characters and its own creators, and so it's kind of strange, I think. And some of it was funny, some of it I did enjoy, but then when I started thinking about it, why are they poking fun at themselves? Like, this whole show is based on that stuff, and instead of actually making new stories and new ideas with that style, instead they're simply parodying itself. It's parodying its own past, its own previous versions in such a nasty way. And when Kirk was being mocked for his bad acting of the way he delivers his lines unrealistically, he says that it's unrealistic for a lady to be the first officer, so that's obviously a poke at the original episode. It's also funny how they keep mentioning Pelia as being the supervisor of Scotty. She's the one who taught him everything he knows. She was his teacher at the academy. She keeps telling him what to do, and yet we never see her. She keeps being mentioned, and yet we barely see her. She's constantly on vacation or something. She doesn't come to the meetings. She doesn't do anything on the show, and yet she's keeping being mentioned as the mentor of Scotty. So Scotty only ever became the man he was later because of Pelia, who taught him everything. That's the same kind of thing they're constantly doing with all the characters. Remember how in Discovery they said that Spock only became the man he was because of who his sister was. And so they're constantly undermining all the legacy characters. And they did the same kind of thing with Spock in previous episodes as well. Even in the last one, I forgot to mention it in my review, that there was actually a scene of Spock trying to scan for Klingon ships and unable to find any. And then Ortega suddenly corrected him and was able to find a Klingon ship that was hiding, which Spock could not. So there are constantly scenes like that of the new female characters undermining the legacy characters and showing that they're actually better than them, and they're the ones who taught them everything they know and stuff like that. So that is also something that's kind of subtle in the show. You almost don't notice it, but it's constantly there. So Scotty learned everything from this woman that we barely even see, so at least show us that. If you keep insisting that he learned everything from her, and yet we don't even see that. And it's so funny that as the ship is flying toward the collapsing neutron star and that puts the whole ship in danger, that's the time that Scotty reroutes all the energy into the holodeck, because running the test on the holodeck is so much more important than the safety of the ship. And then when things go wrong, he never even tells the captain until it's too late. And in the end, they don't discipline him for that decision. Instead, they give him a pep talk saying, oh, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to ask for help from people. As if he's some kind of small child and not an officer on a starship which is supposed to follow the chain of commands and regulations. So the whole show feels like it's a bunch of kids in space. It doesn't feel like adults or professionals. They're all a bunch of kids playing around and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So it's all a bunch of nonsense in my opinion. So I did enjoy all the parts of that show inside the show, because it was actually funny in my opinion, but most of the scenes of that investigation inside the holodeck, which was kind of a parody of that whole idea of the 1950s investigator, and it's always the same kind of pattern, so no one leaves the hotel until we find out who the killer is and all that kind of stuff, which was also done to death in so many other parodies in our vid. So did we actually need to see that? Why not invent something new or something that was not done to death as much, instead of recycling the same ideas again? Was it really worth it? Was it really so funny to do kind of a parody of that? So in my opinion, it was boring. I was literally almost falling asleep in those scenes inside the holodeck. So the only really good scene was the Uhura dialogue, which just proves that they are self-aware of what Star Trek is supposed to be about, and yet they're incapable of actually doing that themselves. They're only capable of making parodies and a mockery of the older shows that actually did do that kind of thing. So in the end of the day, I was much more annoyed by this episode than I was entertained. So that's all I had to say about it for today. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.